Simone Zimmerman and Aaron Axelman, thank you so much for joining me at On the Line Media. I want to start with getting right into the film itself and asking you, you're both young American Jews. You've been raised to unconditionally love Israel. At what point did that change for you? If I could start with you, Simone.
Yeah, this all changed for me when I went to college. I actually planned to go do Israel advocacy when I was an undergraduate student. And uh, very quickly, I found myself inside debates about actually, there was a student movement on campus calling on the university to divest from companies that had profited off of the 2009 war on Gaza. Um, which at the time, it's like so painful to remember, that was the bloodiest operation in many years, right? And now we're here in tens of exponents more in terms of the death count. But at the time, that was a historic assault on the Palestinian people by the state of Israel. And there was a student movement calling on the university to divest from American weapons companies that had profited off of that moment. And I very quickly realized that the talking points that I had about the Israeli army being the most moral army in the world just simply did not hold up to the stories that I was hearing, the testimonies, not just from my own classmates, but testimonies from people on the ground who had lived through that assault. And that catapulted for me a journey of learning and unlearning. I actually, went to the occupied territories and saw the reality there firsthand. I began reading Palestinian scholars, and very quickly, so many of the myths that I had been raised on about you know, um, the the justness of Israel and the Israel as this vulnerable, embattled state, I was completely shattered by understanding that there's that the Palestinian people since 1948 have actually been oppressed and dispossessed by this state, and their stories are too often left out, not just of the discussion in the American Jewish community, but in the American political system more broadly.
How about for you, Aaron? When was that turning point?
Totally. Yeah, my story is very much related to the protagonists in our film, obviously, including Simone's, but it's slightly different. I grew up in a very small Jewish community in rural Maine, and really learning about Israel as a young person, especially after my bar mitzvah, was incredibly empowering. It made me feel like I was connected to the larger Jewish community and a larger Jewish world that I didn't get to experience as a young person. And especially as someone who, experienced, mild anti-Semitism. I grew up in a very conservative rural place where people believed a lot of conspiracy theories against Jews. Learning about Israel was incredibly empowering, and learning it really felt like the light at the end of the tunnel after so much oppression that the Jewish people have faced and that my family faced as well in Europe. But I had a teacher in my public school in Maine who was a real mentor of mine and who was just surprised by how pro-Israel I was. And in my senior year of high school, gave me a number of history books by both Palestinian historians like Rashid Khalidi and Edward Said, as well as actually very importantly for me, left-wing Israeli historians, including at the time Tom Segev, who spoke openly about the Nakba and the occupation and began talking about the side of the story that I had not learned. As someone talked about, the Israeli narrative that I grew up with didn't really mention Palestinians at all. Either pretended Palestinians didn't exist, or if it acknowledged they existed, they were something to be dealt with. They were a small people that were not important, that had not taken care of the land, those kind of racist tropes. And so it was really just learning about the Nakba and the occupation that began to open my eyes. And when I got to college, I met Palestinians for the first time who had lived under Israeli apartheid and who had lived their entire lives without basic freedoms that I took for granted. And then I actually spent 3 months living in Israel, Palestine in 2011. And that was when I actually saw the occupation for the first time, and also, really saw the remnants of the Nakba, walking, throughout Israel, Palestine, and seeing the destroyed villages from 1948, whose descendants are still alive, had a profound impact on me. So it was both, reading key Palestinian and Israeli historians, as well as actually seeing it for myself, that changed me.
But do you think it takes that? I mean, you both visited Israel, Palestine. You spoke to Palestinians there. You went to the occupied West Bank. Do you think it takes a physical sort of going there to understand what living under occupation has been like? Is that necessary?
I would say that going there and seeing it it just makes the talking points fall apart just much more blatantly because, when you're told that um, there is no occupation or that, there is no apartheid, and then you walk down streets where Palestinians can't walk, in the city of Hebron, which Congressman Jamal Bowman did a couple years ago. Um, and he saw the apartheid firsthand and, saw Israeli soldiers manning checkpoints and, checking based on your nationality who can walk, who can drive. That fundamentally changed him and made him one of the most outspoken advocates for Palestinian freedom in the US Congress. And it's what made him, one of the number one target of AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby, which actually just made history by spending more money than ever in an American primary race to defeat him. And um, and that being said, I don't think it's essential to go there and see firsthand. I think right now with social media, seeing young Palestinians from Gaza live streaming the horrors of the genocide, everybody has what they need right now to be educated, to get the information that they need to know that what is happening right now is wrong and that they don't have to support it. But I think it is the reality on the ground held up against the lies that were fed in our media that really makes the whole argument fall apart.
Oh, I want to get to this. What you focus in on the film also is this level of inculcation and sort of indoctrination that young Jewish Americans receive. And I want to ask both of you, at what age is your first memory of sort of being given this origin story of Israel? Like, what are your first memories of indoctrination?
Want to go first, Simone, and then I can go after.
Sure. I mean, these stories have been with me since I was a child. My grandfather was born in Warsaw, Poland in the 30s, and his family escaped to pre-state Palestine. And, you know, everyone in his family who didn't get out was killed in the Holocaust. And that narrative of Israel being a safe haven was quite literally true in my family. The only problem with that story is that that safe haven came at the cost of the Nakba, the displacement of the Palestinian people. Over 750,000 people whose villages were destroyed, who were evicted from their homes, and who continue to experience this ongoing, not just dispossession and expulsion, but the destruction of their lives in their homeland. And that has always been um, the cost of the founding of the Jewish state. And so, um, and for so many of us, we don't get that part of the story, right? We just get the story of our families fleeing anti-Semitism, of our families, our people needing a safe haven. And I think that story runs very deep in many Jewish communities, and the ongoing, and I'll say that the way that the state of Israel continues to maintain its legitimacy with Jews around the world is by kind of positioning itself as the protector of Jews against anti-Semitism. Right now, I think it's so essential that we interrogate that idea because, of course, Israel is arguably the most dangerous place in the world to be a Jew right now. I think that idea, Israel is not keeping Jews safe. And I think the idea that for Jews to have to be safe, Palestinians have to face apartheid, occupation, expulsion, genocide, that is so first of all, like offensive and insulting to me as a person, who my own family history leads me to be against all those things. But I also don't think that's a recipe for safety for anybody.
I mean, you also had the President Biden come out during this time and say that, Israel is the only place where Jews can actually be safe. Aaron, how about you? How did that change?
Totally. And it was different for me. And again, I didn't go to Jewish day school. I went to public school in rural Maine. But Israel was a big part of my kind of family's mythology and family story. Through marriage, we're related to Levi Eshkol, the prime minister who began the occupation, who operated the 1967 war, and I grew up thinking that that was amazing. My dad spent time in Israel in the 60s and hung out with Levi Eshkol and his family, and kind of treated extremely well by kind of the top echelons of Israeli society. My Hebrew school, my rabbi was in his late 70s, 80s when I was when I was in Hebrew school. And so to him, he was born well before the state of Israel existed. He was certainly a Zionist. Israel was not the biggest part of my Jewish education, though. We talked about Israel. We celebrated Israel's birthday. I remember celebrating Israel's 50th birthday in 1998. And so it was kind of this kind of, mildly, it was a big part of Jewish identity. It was kind of this wonderful place across the sea, but we didn't talk about it in extreme detail. And it wasn't, I didn't really kind of fall in love with Israel until my bar bat mitzvah, when I was given a ton of pro-Israel novels by my relatives, especially the book Exodus by Leon Uris, which kind of talks about the creation of the state of Israel in this almost mythological sense. It was created, it was turned into a film, in the 50s. That was a huge blockbuster. And it really tells the story of the creation of Israel, kind of as Simone talked about, right? Israel is the safe haven. Israel is the place where the Jews were able to find safety after the Holocaust and after, hundreds and thousands of years of oppression. But that story doesn't talk about Palestinians at all. It essentially, again, either pretends that Palestinians don't exist, or if they do exist, it is shocked that they don't accept Jewish statehood, that they don't accept the Zionist project, which again, the idea of which is to create essentially a Jewish-only state where Palestinians lived. And so, but that, that story of Israel's founding and my own family's relationship to Israeli history was incredibly inspiring. And when I really read that book, Exodus, I became obsessed with Israel. And it really became my Jewish identity, like Israel is the Jewish identity of many of the folks in the film. And it wasn't until, again, in high school that I really began to read about Palestinians that I realized that I had fallen in love with a story that was completely one-sided. And that was actually very similar to the traditional American story. I grew up in rural Maine, miles away from massive Native American massacres. My town was obviously founded by the displacement and massacres of Native Americans, and we never learned about it growing up. It was completely hidden from us. It was, something that was completely ignored. And when I obviously began learning about those massacres, I was incredibly shocked. And that kind of transformation, that recognition that I had learned a story that totally erased another people was shocking to me, and really made me realize that, again, Israel is very much like America in many, many different ways.
Why do you think, and this is something that I've been thinking about why do you think you and Simone were sort of receptive? In high school, Aaron, you could have easily said, I don't want to read this garbage. I don't want to read Rashid Khalidi or what is. Don't give me these books. Like, what do you think it is that makes some people receptive to learn about the other, whereas some people just reject it outright and say, I don't believe this at all?
Yeah.
Because we're actually seeing people watch people get maimed and murdered, but I read online people saying, "Oh, this isn't true. Or this is in Syria, or this is in wherever." Right?
Yeah.
There are people who will deny what is right before their eyes. So, what do you think that where that comes from?
I think for me and for many of my friends, I think we support Israel growing up because we are told that Israel is an incredibly progressive state, that Israel has liberal progressive values. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is amazing for queer rights. And so we learned about Israel as a progressive state in line with our progressive values. The great majority of American Jews are incredibly progressive on the great majority of political issues, especially domestic issues. And so we learned about Israel in a way that feels very consistent with our values. The reason why I think so many of us changed, and again, so many American Jews have changed to the point where, about even polling before October 7th shows that about 40% of young Jews under 40 think Israel is an apartheid state. The reason why so many of us change is because we realize that Israel is not aligned with our progressive values. So I think seeing the juxtaposition of Israel's actions against the narratives that we were told about Israel. And again, Simone said, we learned that Israel's army is the most moral army in the world. When we see that Israel does not align with our values, we're shocked. And it causes us to either, again, change our position on Israel or change our core values.
I saw this film, I think it was 7 months ago, and you were in attendance, Aaron. This was in Toronto. And we couldn't see it in the theater. I remember we saw it in a great big hall. And so this film has, I mean, a lot of people have tried to have it banned in certain places. Was that the type of response you were expecting?
Yeah, to a certain extent. This is my first film as a director, but we have two really amazing producers. One is a British Jewish man who actually joined the IDF as a young person and had a similar transformation to the folks in the film, and one is this really incredible Palestinian American producer. And both of them have been involved in films on Palestine before, and so having their guidance was incredibly helpful. And they, certainly anticipated we would get a lot of public backlash, which we certainly did. But very luckily, there's been virtually no successful actual cancellations. There have been venues that again have not been willing to screen the film, and again, like in Toronto, there have been many instances in which community groups have tried to host the film in large theaters, and the theaters have said no, and we've had to kind of improvise and do larger community spaces. So in some ways, we did expect this reaction, and I think we were pretty well prepared for it. But it is different when it actually happens, and it certainly has been bizarre and shocking at times. The things people have said about our film and have said about us. I know Simone has obviously dealt with a lot of backlash, for just very reasonable things she's done. So again, there were many examples and kind of role models for us about what to do when you face pretty kind of crazy backlash. Um, so it's been certainly an interesting ride and one that is not over. We're still going to do many, many, many screenings, and we anticipate there will certainly be backlash to many more of our screenings.
Simone, you touch on a lot of that pushback that you received in the film. You're called, the usual sort of tropes of self-hating Jew, anti-Semitic, etc. I just spent the last 63 days covering the Toronto student encampment at the University of Toronto here. And if not now, was there Independent Jewish Voices. The Jewish Faculty Network was also inside the encampment. And I saw firsthand a lot of these accusations being leveled at Jewish students and both Jewish faculty. How do you deal with that on what seems like a daily basis, this bombardment of accusations?
Yeah, I mean, it's an intimidation strategy, you know? The goal is to scare people, to intimidate them, to make the cost of speaking out too high. So, I think for me, sometimes I just have to remind myself that, you know, find ways to kind of drown out some of that noise, um, not let the attacks, they can be very painful and personal, um, not let them get to me, have support systems, not even checking certain like social media. But at the end of the day, I think you have to remember that it is the goal of this is to shut us up. And so if you don't shut up, then their tactics can't work.
I in 2018 when I was at the CBC, this is Canada's national public broadcaster, I put a panel together of young Israelis and young Palestinians speaking to one another. And the Israeli ambassador to Canada got very angry about this, wrote into the show, and said that this is not a reflection of what Israeli society really is. And there was this sort of idea that progressive Jewish voices are not the norm, that you are outliers. What's your response to that?
Yeah, it's quite offensive actually, and pretty ridiculous. I mean, there's always been very critical voices within the North American Jewish community that have spoken out strongly against Israel's actions and even of the Zionist movement's actions before 1948. And again, it is true that for many decades after 1948, especially in the decades after the 67 war, the great majority of our community was essentially unconditionally supportive of Israel. But even despite that, there were always groups like Bray Ra and other groups that were fighting against the status quo. But especially in the past couple decades, groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, even J Street and other groups like that have significantly upended that status quo. And we are no longer in a place where there is one major American Jewish opinion. We are a deeply divided community. And that is the much more accurate depiction of our community than opposed to, again, what a lot of Israeli spokespeople like to say is that we're all united in our support for Israel. I think I mentioned before, polling from 2021 shows that about 40% of American Jews under 40 think Israel is an apartheid state. And again, that was a few years ago. I do think we are at the point where we are either approaching a majority or we are a majority of younger Jews who feel horrified by Israel's actions against the Palestinian people. And polling from a few months ago shows that a majority of American Jews want a ceasefire. They do not want this horrific genocidal war to continue, despite what many of the proposed leaders of our community and Israeli leaders say. So again, we are a deeply divided and polarized community, and we feel that we are accurately representing the dynamics of a community, and that it is groups like AIPAC and the ADL who believe in this fiction of a united American Jewish opinion.
You spoke of the ADL, and I remember Jonathan Greenblatt, the current executive director, talking about how they're losing the youth. You know, this was about 6, 7 months ago. There was a released audio of him talking about TikTok, and you see the U.S. Congress banning TikTok or trying to ban TikTok. Simone, you touched on this earlier about social media.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think because you mentioned the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, I do want to say, first of all, that I think, the actions of this organization over the last 9 months and frankly, well before that, have just, demonstrated again that the failure of so many of the organizations that claim to be working to protect diaspora Jewry, American Jews specifically in this context, right? And the Anti-Defamation League, which claims to be like the leading civil rights organization fighting anti-Semitism, time and again chooses its agenda of Israel advocacy over actually fighting anti-Semitism and protecting American Jews. So they spend most of their resources, demonizing, smearing pro-Palestinian activists, including Jewish activists. They included every Jewish-led ceasefire protest in their list of anti-Semitic incidents that they published at the end of 2023. So this goes back to the point that I made at the beginning of our conversation, that it's just incredibly dangerous that we've seen organizations that claim to be acting to protect Jews fuse that agenda with an Israel advocacy agenda, especially in this moment in which the stakes of using Jews to defend Israel is so dangerous. And we see that the backlash that can happen to Jewish communities around the world for being associated with this genocidal war actually also endangers Jews. The other thing I want to say about that is that part of the ADL's strategy and so many of these other organizations is once again about changing the topic, right? Away from what is happening on the ground, away from the horrors happening in Gaza and the West Bank, across historic Palestine, and onto this conversation about anti-Semitism. I think it's much harder to do that when people can see what's happening for themselves, right? We don't have to get these stories filtered through the lens of mainstream media. And we can see how deep the media bias actually runs right now. And I think we're seeing a real rebellion against that, not just from American Jews, but from young people, from progressives, from Black and Brown communities across the world, frankly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually met Jonathan Greenblatt maybe 6 years ago or something at a talk in Aspen. And I said, yeah, we're making a film on the changing American-Jewish relationship to Israel. We interviewed the former head of the ADL, Abe Foxman, and he seemed interested. I said, yeah, it's largely about kind of what happens when young American Jews learn about the occupation. And I said the word occupation, and his eyes got big, and he immediately walked away from the conversation. And when he talks about the fact that he's losing, or that the kind of larger pro-Israel organizations are losing young people, when these organizations refuse to acknowledge reality and refuse to talk about basic facts about Palestinian existence, and young people learn about Israel for 10, 12 years over and over and again, but never hear a single thing about Palestinians. When they do hear about Palestinians, they are going to feel incredibly resentful and feel like they have been lied to, and feel like they have been betrayed by their educators and their leaders for telling them so much supposed about Israel, but not mentioning basic facts about an entire people whose existence has been in many ways destroyed by Israel. So again, and if you really don't want to lose young people, talk to them about Palestine. We interviewed many, kind of pro-Israel rabbis, and so a lot of them would say, well, we know that young people need to learn about the existence of Palestinians, but we're just not sure when to talk to them about it. 6, 7, 8, it's just too young, it's too complex. What I always say is that, Germans learn about the Holocaust in elementary school, right? They learn about their grandparents butchering millions of people. If they can learn about the Holocaust, right, in elementary school, young American Jews can learn about the Nakba and the occupation from a young age, right? All we are risking is our denial, right? There's no risk to our education by simply learning basic facts about the Palestinian people.
It feels like though there is a bit of a reckoning, even though there is this pushback, and the sort of more pro-Israeli side scrambling to keep the narrative where it is. It does feel like there is a bit of a reckoning right now, and a lot of my Jewish friends are not having a good time. This is a very personal thing. A lot of them, like a friend of mine, was not invited to her cousin's wedding because of her activism. And so I'm just wondering how are you both doing? Um, you know, how are you handling this right now?
Want to go first,
Yeah,
Simone?
and I mean, I think it is an incredibly painful time, and it is the way this is playing out inside our families and communities is um, can be very intimate and devastating, frankly. But it's also important for me to say that, the discomfort that I experience, like in the community that I come from, is nothing compared to the injustice that is happening right now. And I think that it is worth it to take the risk to jeopardize even relationships. I don't take lightly the personal risks that people do have to take right now. But for me, it feels um, worth it because people are dying in Gaza right now. And if my voice as an American Jew can help more people join the movement and more people, have the courage to speak out and take action, that is worth it to try to help save lives and to try to help change the situation. I think that, even if we had a ceasefire tomorrow, the amount of destruction that Israel has unleashed on Gaza is going to take decades in a good scenario to rebuild, and the fight for a future, a genuinely just, safe, free future for all people in that land is extremely far from us, and it's going to take the shifting of deeply ingrained narratives, across communities. It's going to take like millions of us and such a radical political change in order to actually achieve that future. And I want to just say one other thing that connects to the point that Aaron made before about, what are we risking by talking about these, painful, darker sides of our history? Again, having this conversation as an American, it's important to say that like part of the reason the attack on the Palestine movement or on those of us trying to talk about the Palestinian experience, the reason these attacks are gaining such momentum is because um, those who don't want us to talk about Palestinian history are making common cause with those who also don't want us to talk about Black history in America, right? And who don't want us to talk about the history of Indigenous people in this country. And so, and all of that together is part of this, broader movement, this, right wing, racist, authoritarian movement that is not just in the US, it's an authoritarian movement that we're seeing around the world. Israel is a key player in that global authoritarian movement. And so there's a lot at stake here for this broader for democracy, for human rights, for justice for all people, and it's also very much a conversation for Americans, and that's why I think so many people see their own oppression, their own yearnings for freedom, also mirrored in the movement for Palestinian freedom, because they can see the way that America's support for this war is also about other injustices and oppression that are part of the American system, right? Our corrupt campaign finance, the erosion of our democracy, the racism at the root of this country. And so there's so many connections here that people are making. And that's why I think also this movement is resonating so deeply.
Aaron?
Yeah, it's obviously, an incredibly fraught time. As Simone said, the discomfort that American Jews are going through as we process the horrors we're seeing, and again, hopefully begin to process our community's complicity in this, are significant, but don't compare to what Palestinians are going through, and that's obviously important to note. It's incomparable. Um, that being said, there's both incredibly encouraging signs. Many members of my family in their 70s and 80s who were totally unconditionally supportive of Israel are now deeply critical of Israel. My grandparents who passed away probably would have disowned me for making this film, and I thought many of my older relatives would have, who are still alive, would have as well, and many of them love the film and say that I was right. For the years that I argued with them. It obviously is incredibly. It's nightmarish to see so many of my own community support this genocidal war. So many within, the reform movement and the conservative movement, support the unjustifiable. And it is, it's nightmarish, and it breaks my heart every day to see so many, American Jewish leaders unconditionally support this war, and unconditionally support Israel's policies. And then, so it's obviously a harrowing moment. And it is, it's weird to be called an anti-Semite. My family fled violent anti-Semitism. I have family members who died because of violent anti-Semitism. So it's certainly bizarre and strange, but my conscience is clean, and I feel that we are going to be on the right side of history.
It feels a little bit like we're living in the upside down right now. But I'm also heartened, and Simone, I think you can speak better to this as the co-founder of If Not Now. As much as pushback as you're getting, are you finding there's an unbelievable wave of solidarity also that I have never seen before in the pro-Palestinian movement? What has that been like for you to sort of see that support coming in?
Yeah, I mean, as Aaron already said, we're seeing the polling. Another number that Aaron didn't mention that I want to bring up is that a recent poll actually showed that over 50% of U.S. Jews want the U.S. to stop sending weapons to Israel over the invasion of Rafah. So, what we're talking about here is really a historic shift that people are trying to underplay. And it has been deeply inspiring to see so many Jews in the movement for Palestinian freedom, so many people taking those risks, and also people outside of our community appreciating the risks that many of us are taking. But again, as I already said, I think that US Jews are just one small piece of this broader movement, not just of Americans, but of people around the world who see the absolute horrors that are being inflicted every single day on the Palestinian people, and are seeing that and are saying, not in my name, not just as a Jew, not just as an American, but as a citizen of the world, or as a citizen of other countries that are funding these massacres, right? Funding and backing these massacres. And all of us saying together, we don't want to live in a world where, international law is applied so selectively, where, children can, their bodies can be ripped apart, and we can see it on our phone screens, and we can't do anything to stop it. And we know that standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people right now and standing against this mass killing is about fighting for a world of safety and freedom for all people. And so I think, in that sense, Jews in this movement are not exceptional. We are part of this global community of people who are speaking out and calling for freedom and justice. And yeah, it's meaningful to be a part of that. But more importantly, it's the right thing to do. There's nothing else I can do right now than try to fight and stop the killing.
Aaron, what's the one thing you want people to take away from this film the most?
That's a great question, and I think that's probably changed as I've seen people's reactions to the film over time. I think, the most beautiful thing I think that people have said about the film, including, folks that I've looked up to for years and years and years, like Naomi Klein, is that our film shows that people can change, that with new information, people can really, really change. I mean, again, the stat that I talked about almost 40% of young Jews, thinking Israel's an apartheid state. I'm guessing almost none of them began their education believing that. Almost none of them. So almost half of young Jews have already gone through a profound transformation, where they initially, again, believed these kind of myths of Israel's creation, just like we learned myths about America and Canada's creation. And upon more accurate information about what the state of Israel actually cost the Palestinian people, we have changed our minds and we have changed our actions. And someone, this really amazing Palestinian activist, Ahmed Dean, said yesterday that showing that people can change helps, I think, the world show that not only is, freedom for the Palestinians possible, but that it is plausible, that people can change. As we talked about a little bit earlier, I think even off camera, you know, it did not appear like South Africa would change, and then it changed, right? Things can change and people can change. And I do believe that so many people 20 years from now will look back at this and be horrified that their community members or even themselves were supportive of this. So I think, again, I changed myself. And, if not now, was so inspiring to me because it really showed this generational change happening in real time. And when I, learned about Simone's story, it was incredibly inspiring. And so I think that ability to change in profound ways while still holding on to our Jewishness. Again, many of us are doing this because we are Jewish, because our families have faced the types of violence that people in Gaza are facing right now, that we know we cannot support this violence, that we must support peace and justice.
Simone, for you?
Yeah, I think Aaron pretty much said it, but I think the idea that that people can change is also a really important message for me. And I think the other message, um, you know, is for Jewish people to understand that if you're horrified by what you're seeing in Gaza and you feel like you're alone in your community, that you're actually not, that you're part of this movement of us, not just across the country, but Jewish people around the world who are speaking out from a deep place of Jewish values and Jewish tradition, in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and then for people beyond our community to understand that fighting anti-Semitism is not in opposition to the fight for Palestinian freedom, despite what we get told so often by so many people with prominent platforms, and not to let those intimidation tactics stop you from speaking out.
Simone and Aaron, thank you so much for joining me on the program.
Thank you so
And if you
much.
haven't seen Israelism, please go and see it. It is a profoundly beautiful film, not just for the shifts that you see the characters taking, but also in its exposure of that level of indoctrination and what it does, the impact that it has on people.
Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much. Appreciate it,
Thank you
Samira.
so much.